Spectrum, of all your things, it seems like the Jones have the most, how do you say, progressive? Oh, it's just defining?
So you've been in
No, we just been reading their shit, and I didn't know it was gonna be.
We're all here now.
Yeah.
There's a couple of chairs here.
3 chairs.
Come in, meet us. I've seen the movie, Oh, good.
So I can truncate my introduction if you wanted to actually say things about his work. Okay, so I won't say anything about the ideas. I'm just going to mention.
There's 2 seats, there's 2 seats.
And I'll leave.
This one here, this one there. Do you want to sit? This one's.
So we have some more seating here for those of you who are standing, at least a couple of chairs. I think we're ready to begin. My name is Peter. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights. Before we start, if you would kindly turn the volume down on your phones. And while you're doing so, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening here at City Lights. As many of you know, we're a publishing house as well as a bookstore. In fact, behind these walls here are the editorial offices of City Lights. You'll notice a case over here that says City Lights Poetry. We continue to publish poetry in the grand tradition of the Pocket Poet series. Most recently, a wonderful new series that's a little more than 10 years old. It's called the Spotlight series. There's a new book from Edmund Berrigan out on that. And also a really great standalone, a Stephen Jonas reader, which we're very, very proud of. We'll be having an event for that very soon. And then we continue to publish a lot of nonfiction, as of course tonight's book is a great example. But we just did a new book for Michael Long, documenting a history of nonviolent protest in the United States. Also a new book from Tosh Berman, which is a biographical work exploring growing up with Wallace Berman, the creator of Semina, down in Los Angeles. That kind of wonderful intersection between kind of Northern California and Southern California artists and musicians and actors and so on. We also just did a new book for Octavio Solis called Retablos, stories from a life lived along the border. And you know, there's much more to come. So if you're interested in City Lights books, you can go onto our website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter, which on our homepage on the left side, there's a little place where you put in your email, and it's very easy to unsubscribe if you become overwhelmed. But there's a lot going on, also event-wise. So I encourage you all, keep an eye on our website, go on the calendar to find out about what's going on in terms of events, and much more. So, you know, always especially auspicious when we're celebrating a City Lights book. And tonight is a very interesting release because it's the first time that City Lights has actually attempted a graphic novel. And so we're very excited about that. The book is called Herbert Marcuse, Philosopher of Utopia, a Graphic Biography. It's by Nick Torkelson, and it's edited by Paul Buell and Andrew T. Lamas. It's got a foreword by Angela Davis, which is very cool indeed. And, you know, as I said, we published it. So really honored to have Nick Torkelson here with us. He's going to be in conversation with Larry Gonick. Mr. Torkelson is an illustrator living in Boston. His political cartoons have appeared in the Boston Globe. He is the co-author and illustrator of books such as The Earth Belongs to the People, The Underhanded History of the United States, The Legal Rights of Union Stewards, among others. He's contributed to a number of nonfiction comic anthologies. He's working on a graphic novel about the end of the 60s called A Better World is Possible. Mr. Torkelson has also worked as a composer, a musician, an animator, graphic designer, and painter. And as I mentioned, he's joined tonight by Larry Gonick, who's a cartoonist specializing in nonfiction books. He is best known for his cartoon histories as well as his cartoon guides to various sciences. And he is co-author with Tim Kasser of Hypercapitalism, The Modern Economy, Its Values and How to Change Them, published by the New Press. He makes his home here in San Francisco. So tonight's event is being co-sponsored by the San Francisco chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. And to get the evening started, I'd like to welcome Alex Gorelick.
That's how you pronounce it. Just going to take a few minutes to steal from Nick here to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here. Many of you may know about our organization, maybe you don't. Kind of interesting, when we took this on, we had no idea of the connection between Herbert Marcuse and Michael Harrington, and our founding of our organization is actually alluded to in the book. Am I right in remembering it correctly? Nick, it's alluded to?
Indirectly, yes.
Indirectly, like I said, alluded to. So, we were started in 1971 by Michael Harrington, who is mentioned in this book. I'm on the education committee. We're the largest socialist group in the United States. Currently, we have 1,300 members here in San Francisco proper, and that's part of over 60,000 nationally. We have an extensive education offerings. I'll get into that shortly. You may have been hearing about some of our proteges, both AOC and Representative Omar are both DSA members and got their career, their political start with our orgs out in Minneapolis and Brooklyn. But we're not a political party. We are more about bringing issues to light, political education, and we're a broad tent socialist organization. So beyond our education offerings, we have a lot of activism. 16 different committees doing different issues. In case this group particularly wants education offerings, we've had a whole series this year of working with PM Press, but also City Lights, local publishers, bringing authors to our community. And we just had a dialogue seminar with Nick Sunday night, which I think went very well, and some of you I think actually went to it. So happy to see you again. And so education offerings include, we have an introduction to socialist class. We have a Marx reading group, which has been ongoing for 2 years. They're almost finished with Das Kapital, they tell me. I don't necessarily believe that. Yeah, they're working on it, and they've been working on it for 2 years. So what do you do to find out more about the organization? Look at the website. I have a lot of materials over here. Feel free to ask me questions afterwards. The real thing I would recommend you do is, of course, look at the website, and we have an intro to DSA course, which is not course, but it's really an event. It's at May 5th at Alley Cat's Books in the Mission. We have lots of affiliates, in case you're not from San Francisco. So if you're from down south or north or east, we have lots of affiliates all over the place. We have over 200 in the United States, but certainly in the Bay Area. So go to the May 5th event, and then go to our general chapter meeting. We actually have one tomorrow, but they are a bit daunting for newcomers because we actually do a lot of business and get through things really fast. So it's hard to deal with this if that's your first thing in the organization. But we'd love to have you come by. I will stop stealing time from Nick and turn it back over to Peter.
So we have there's a seat over here for those of you on the stairwell, and there's one right here. So please, if you have a chance to come in. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me okay back there? Yeah. I was going to introduce myself, but it's not necessary. I'm Larry Gonick. I do need to, since I can't, it's just wrong for a cartoonist to get in front of an audience and not promote himself. This is Hypercapitalism, last year's book, the latest one I've done, a sort of return to my roots, which brings me back to Nick. Actually, before I start, I want to thank the people in the front row. They were the last ones to arrive. It was empty for the longest time. And there's a reason for that, which you're about to discover, which is that cartoonists are scary people. At least they seem scary. We hide behind our drawing boards and lob drawings. Well, this is a question about how much difference it makes, actually, and I think Nick is somebody who has quite a bit to say about that. I first met him in the early 1970s when I was just starting to cartoon, and he was already well into it, and I was referred to a group that he worked with called Urban Planning Aid, a very innocuous name. This was in Central Square in Cambridge, and Urban Planning Aid was actually sort of a hotbed of activism on all kinds of issues. And Nick, I would say, was their, I would call him the intellectual godfather or leader of their propaganda efforts. How to use posters and cartoons and imagery and messages in ways that were then unconventional. That is, Nick is not only a practicing cartoonist, he's also a student of the medium, and he's thought a lot about what voice to use, how to challenge various sort of conventional imagery, like the top-hatted capitalist. That's something I took to heart in hypercapitalism. No capitalist looks like that anymore. They look like people in hoodies and expensive T-shirts. They wear polo shirts with, handcrafted by tailors in Dubai. But so he's had a lot of influence on I would say, the cartooning of the modern left. He had a lot of influence on me personally. I've sidestepped a lot of political cartooning for many years before coming back to it, but nevertheless, his influence remains. Oh yes, I guess it was at Urban Planning Aid that I first saw that book about how to read Donald Duck. Do we know that one? The Chileans, is it Ariel Dorfman? Yeah, about how Uncle Scrooge is an imperialist and all those, these adventures that I loved as a child. All of these exotic places, quotes around exotic. So my notion for the evening is I'm going to stop talking now and let Nick speak for himself and show his work, and then we'll have a conversation. Obviously, any of your questions are welcome. I have a few of my own, and we'll try not to preempt you very much, but I've got a couple I really want to ask. So, without further ado, Nick Torkelson.
Thanks so much, David. So tonight, this is a reading that we used to launch a book, and I will show you panels from 3 different sections of Herbert Marcuse, Philosophy of Utopia. But first, I wanted to show you a cartoon by Larry Gonick from that period that he just mentioned, the early 70s. Me and 2 people in the audience were putting out a press service for community newspapers, and Larry did this wonderful cartoon about the multinational, a parody of a certain kind of an advertisement. And I have never forgotten that line: close down that dump in Dedham and open the same dump in Mexico City or Bangkok. And watch your profits soar. What more could you want? Nothing. We offer 3-way protection and so on. Nelson Rockefeller was our favorite heavy in those days. He's saying, going multinational is a great way to make friends. I have 30 friends and they run Argentina.
And in the lower right-hand corner, Fidel is saying, offer void where prohibited by law.
So, our elevator speech when we were developing this project was, Herbert Marcuse, the German emigre philosopher, was a two-revolution man. He participated in the uprising of the Spartacists in Berlin in 1919, took up arms in that cause, and in 1968, at the epicenter of the 60s rebellions, he was a hero to the young people protesting the war and protesting racism and so on. So this is the section about 1919. And I'm going to read you the captions, because it's kind of small for the people in the back. When World War I broke out, Marcuse was drafted. He was consigned to the rear echelon due to poor eyesight. He wound up wiping horses' asses for the infantry. That's Marcuse's words, wiping horses' asses. The war was supposed to last a few weeks, but dragged on for years. And here's Marcuse overhearing 2 plutocrats in a club saying, "Here's to war, my God, how the money rolls in." Back at the barracks, somebody says to him, "So you're upset about war profiteering? The arrogance of the officers and the whole imperial project that got us into this mess. You should join our socialist movement." Marcuse says, "But didn't the socialists vote for the war?" Well, everybody wanted a war back then. The war was also supposed to neutralize the burgeoning social sentiment of the pre-war years. Instead, for millions of working-class soldiers on all sides, it replaced the slow death of the impoverished wage earner with certain slaughter. And here's an officer sending these men into battle, and he asks, "Why are you bleeding like sheep?" And they say, "We know we won't return." This is a true incident. I think it was actually the French army, but it could have been any of the belligerents in that meat grinder of a war. The social democratic ideal of gradual change began to give way to revolutionism. So in 1918, at the end of the war, revolution replaced the German Empire with a republic led by the Social Democrats. SPD is the acronym in German. The party Marcuse had joined during the war, but as soon as they tasted power, the SPD leaders turned their attention to comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. And here's an SPD leader saying, "Don't worry, Herr Juncker, we will not tamper with your prerogatives and privileges, and any of our constituents who objects will be dealt with severely." And there's Marcuse outside. I have lots of windows with people observing each other. There's Marcuse saying, what? 1919, the Berlin workers see the SPD turning against them, and they rise up. As a soldiers' council delegate, Marcuse was sent to the barricades to defend the uprising. His assignment was to return the fire of right-wing militias, the Freikorps, which were the predecessors of the stormtroopers, as many of you know. And I have Marcuse saying, how do I work this? Because he was not a combat veteran, he was someone out of his element. in doing street fighting, but he did some. So, Rosa Luxemburg and other principled socialist leaders who had broken from the SPD to form the Spartacist League joined the revolt. And here's Rosa in the hotel where she was hiding out, saying, "I suppose we knew it was hopeless, but in the time of revolution, the revolutionist has no choice. You cannot be selective in the collective." And here are these Freikorps members posing as policemen, I suppose, saying, "You're under arrest." She's pushed into a car. She says, "I'm ashamed to admit I'm relieved. The year I spent in prison with the weight of history lifted off my shoulders. Not the worst of times, but this was the worst of times for Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered first with a gun butt to the head, and then as they were driving her away, they're cursing and saying, 'She's not dead yet.' Well, I'll take care of it, Lamb." And they drop her into the canal. You won't find her until the spring. So, take a load off, Rosa. When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, you put the load right on me. And a little later in the book, we see Marcuse turning from politics to his intellectual pursuits. And I represented this by this case that says, "In case of disappointment, break the glass. Get out that typewriter." I want to show you some of the sources for the imagery that picture of Marcuse taking off his uniform with the rebels in retreat. That was based on this photograph. I didn't use this one, but it's a very striking photo. This is the Freikorps murderers celebrating after killing Rosa. And I've always been struck by how the guy in the center with the mustache looks so much like young Stalin, who, as you may know, excommunicated Rosa from the revolutionary pantheon later on. So here is a picture that is used to introduce the segment I'm going to show you about Marcuse at the height of his fame. In 1968, during the Days of May, this tremendous uprising of students and workers in Paris, here's Marcuse at a UNESCO conference being mobbed by reporters and fans. He became, as you will learn about it if you read the book, this absolutely unbelievable thing, which is a rock star philosopher. So here's the panel based on that photo. Marcuse was actually in Paris for a UNESCO conference when the 1968 rebellion was gathering steam, and people are shouting, "Professor, you've been described as a guru of the new right." And Marcuse never liked that kind of talk. He's saying, "What? I'm the what? I'm the what? What?" He was invited to address students who had occupied the École des Beaux-Arts, and he is remembered by his student Andy Friedenberg as saying, I greet you in the name of the American movement, and I salute you for rejecting consumerism." And I had to make a somewhat snarky comment about these people producing these beautiful posters that we all admired so much back then, and somebody saying, save these, they'll be valuable someday. There was inspiration closer to home as well. Now, home refers to the University of California at San Diego, the second academic post that Marcuse had. I meant, before I got into the second segment, to briefly give you the history in between. He fled Germany. He was not able to get an academic career in Germany as the Nazis came to power. So he joined the Institute for Social Research, which we remember as the Frankfurt School. He moved with them to the US from Geneva, and they set up shop on the Upper West Side, affiliated with Columbia University. They moved to California, a little bit more about that later, and that's where he broke with them, or they broke with him, and he went to work for the government along with a lot of his colleagues in the Institute in the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, oddly enough, and from there he went to the State Department until his first wife died, and he was able to get out of the government, which he was very sick of by then, and he did research on Russia for Harvard and and well, for Columbia University, an institute at Columbia, and then at Harvard, and then he eventually got an academic post at Brandeis. He was forced out of there, and he got this job at UCSD. So this is what I mean when I say close to home. Here we are in Ocean Beach in San Diego, one of those several beach towns that lead up the coast towards La Jolla, where the campus is. And Angela Davis had been his student at Brandeis and followed his colleague Theodore Adorno to Frankfurt, and then could not stand being away from the U.S. as the Black Power movement was emerging, so she transferred to UCSD, but at this point in the story, she hasn't quite got there yet. So even before Angela Davis's return from Germany, the circle of young activists studying with Marcuse and their scene down the beach from UCSD's La Jolla campus allowed Marcuse to become a student again. And George Katsifikis was one of his grad students, and he told me about this place called Red House, where they would regularly have these events like what's going on here was typical of Sonora activists talk on class struggle and sanctuary. And Marcuse, in his desire to not be seen as a leader, was quoted as saying, "The student movement does not need a father." Here's the Red House. We went to Ocean Beach and looked, and George Katsifikis told me all the places that people hung out, and this was this place where there were meetings and a lot of the radicals lived. Marcuse had his criticisms of the scene, of course, and here he's reading an underground paper, and the headline is Nelson Rockefeller. I knew he was going to come up again. Nelson Rockefeller sleeps better at night knowing that our anti-CIA coalition has disbanded. And Marcuse says, "I enjoy reading this paper, but do you know how to say megalomania?" There's George blushing down at the bottom of the panel. Asked by Bill Lease and Andrew Feenberg to write something for another radical student periodical, Marcuse offered The Individual in the Great Society. So to give younger people a sense of what that meant, Lyndon Johnson called for programs attacking poverty and discrimination, expanding education and healthcare, and in his rollout speech, he said these things: "With your courage and compassion, we will build a great society, a society where no child will go unfed, no youngster unschooled." That sounds good, right? The great society is not a safe harbor, a resting place. It beckons us to a destiny where the meaning of our lives matches the marvelous products of our labor. The Great Society Initiative gave us Head Start and Medicare, but its centerpiece, the war on poverty, did not end well. So here's Marcuse's critique of that speech, basically. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Free individuals decide what their lives mean and determine the products of their labor accordingly. For an example, I have somebody making shoddy clothing and wishing that they could make something that would not wear out. And the opponent says, "Watch your mouth." And what's wrong with a safe harbor, where life is no longer spent in the struggle for existence? And here's the Commodore bearing down on him while he's enjoying himself in the shallow water. And he's saying, "An effective war on poverty would not increase productivity, but redirect it away from waste and armaments. But in our world, the transfer of power from the individual to the apparatus creates a surplus of aggression, which is released in a war against the poor." And his example of a war against the poor surprised me. He could have been thinking of many things stateside, but he was thinking of the war in Vietnam. And he says, "I have lived through 2 world wars, but I cannot remember any such brazen advertisements of slaughter." Those of you who are my generation surely remember these headlines that we saw every day. Marines killed, 165, 136 Viet Cong killed, more than 240 Reds slain, and we thought nothing of it. But this was unprecedented in Marcuse's experience. LBJ's war on poverty collapsed before the war in Vietnam. So when Angela Davis comes to UCSD from Frankfurt, the scene is not what she was hoping for. She's asking, where are the black students on this campus? Where is the black movement in San Diego? And she's smoking Gauloise. I have that on the testimony of another graduate student, Lowell Bergman, who some of you may know from his days as a journalist at 60 Minutes. She says she felt like an explorer who returns to his homeland with precious bounty and no one to give it to. Her efforts to organize an anti-war demo in downtown San Diego with her fellow Marcuse's grad students ended in farce, and this was another story that Lowell gave me. He was released without being charged, I guess, and at the same time, Angela, one of her fellow radicals, was out front saying, "We're here to bail out our friend who was charged with obstructing pedestrian traffic, but we were wondering how many times have you arrested Jehovah's Witnesses for distributing leaflets?" And the cop in front loses it and says, "You're under arrest." This really happened. She turned her attention to Los Angeles, where, not for the last time, extrajudicial killings of young black people became the focus of mass mobilizations. And she gives the speech, "I never know when the phone rings, will it be a friend saying, 'My house is surrounded by police, get as many people over here as you can.' But the terror is not isolated instances of police brutality, but an everyday instrument of this country's institutions. The whole economy is a war economy." She found herself being treated as a leader of the movement. She briefly joins the Black Panther Party for self-defense and solidarity with their resistance to police brutality, but quits due to party infighting. And this is the second time you hear this line from Rod Stewart. I suppose I should collect my books and get on back to school. But her books, unlike Marcuse's, are people of color like Zora Neale Hurston, Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, C.L.R. James, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Back in San Diego, Davis helped organize UCSD's Black and Chicano students to demand the creation of a Lumumba Zapata College. And here you see Patrice Lumumba and Emiliano Zapata worrying these icons like Socrates and St. Thomas Aquinas and Johannes Goethe and George Washington. The new college within the university would honor Congolese and Mexican revolutionary martyrs and make the campus more welcoming to students of color, but the demand for a new college was not simply about recruiting Black and Chicano students. Students will learn about the crucial role played by colonialism, slavery, genocide, and the development of capitalism. And one of Marcuse's colleagues is saying, couldn't they just talk about minorities who invented things? Marcuse says, I think they want history they can use. These proposals did not thrill the administration. The negotiations dragged on for a year. Finally, as the desperate students were occupying the registrar's office, they learned the faculty senate had agreed to their basic demands. Marcuse played a crucial role in persuading the faculty, and he was one of the first ones through the door during the brief occupation, and he paid to have the door replaced. Marcuse's willingness to step up when needed had a lot to do with Inga. Inga Neumann was his second wife and the widow of his friend Franz Neumann. And I have them in the kitchen. She's saying UCSD wants to get rid of daycare for its Hispanic employees, and Marcuse says, we must do something about this. And people told me that that was something that he said a lot in those years. We must do something about this. We must do something about this. Unlike Herbert, she came from an activist family in Germany, and so she was used to that kind of politics. She was less obliging when it came to inquiries from the media, and the reporter is trying to get his foot in the door and saying, is Professor Marcuse really trying to destroy Western civilization? This is not an exaggeration. I'm on the Herbert Marcuse. I have a Google alerts for Herbert Marcuse, and the great majority of what I get is everything that we hate about modern life, political correctness, and nasty radical professors is all because of Herbert Marcuse and Rudi Deutschke and the long march through the institutions. Inga replies, if people want to know what he has to say, they have to read his books. So media inquiries invariably focused on violence and privation, and I'm going to give you this interview of him by a French journalist. Do you believe in the possibility of revolution in the United States? Absolutely not. Not at all. Why not? Because there is no collaboration between the students and workers, not even at the level that occurred in France in May, and I cannot imagine a revolution without the working class. I like to include that because on the left and on the right, Marcuse has this odd reputation as somebody that didn't care about the struggle between the classes. This was not true. The French voting public seems to have been frightened, not inspired by the May 1968 events. Well, we must fight that fear. Can we fight fear with violence? There is the violence of aggression and the violence of defense. The students say they are opposing the violence of society, legal, institutionalized violence. There's been a lot of fuss about students burning automobiles, but nobody speaks of the thousands killed every year in auto accidents. Why? Because the second crime is profitable. Well, there are some who profit from automobiles, but everybody enjoys them. You have a car yourself and drive it. So Marcuse could have pointed out that he didn't actually know how to drive and he didn't have a car, but instead, he says, this is because society must mobilize its aggressive instincts. Someone doing inhuman, stultifying work all day can sit behind the wheel of a machine more powerful than himself and release this antisocial aggression. So you'd like to see fewer autos. Wouldn't that create difficulties for the auto workers? Then the real work could begin, abolishing poverty and inequality. Might not such privations lead to fascism? An economic crisis offers two possibilities: neo-fascism, which I think we all know what that means, or what precedes that. Neo-fascism or a free society. One cannot, for fear of the first, give up hoping and working for the second. That's kind of the moral of the book. One cannot give up hoping and working for a free life. So for the final piece I want to show you is the conclusion of the book. I visited Marcuse's son, Peter, in Waterbury, Connecticut, and he showed me the family albums. Now, most family albums show people by the water. This might not have been so remarkable, but it was kind of overwhelming how much time the Marcuse family spent enjoying themselves by the water. And these are some of the photos that he showed me. This is from middle age, and this is from his old age. And earlier in the book, I have two, and I'm just including them tonight for the sake of being here in California. Two scenes of Marcuse encountering the Pacific Ocean here in California. When he first came to California with the Institute in the early 40s, it's reported that they came to look at the ocean, and somebody said we should throw out a message in a bottle, and somebody said it should say, "I feel so lousy." Marcuse embraced California. It's natural environment. It's very original culture. Most of his colleagues found it totally hideous, and the other leaders of the Institute, Adorno, Horkheimer, and Pollock, and I don't know how many others, went back to Germany as soon as they could after the war was over. The second time he comes to California, when he gets hired by UCSD, he has a visitor from Waltham, from his Brandeis years, who says, "Herbert, what a contrast with New England." And Herbert says, "Norman, I have always told you winter is a bourgeois ideology." So here's, this is Samuel Beckett, and he was one of Marcuse's favorite writers, and he sent Marcuse a poem in his honor on Marcuse's 80th birthday. So here's the poem. Beckett lived most of his working career in Paris, and he wrote this poem in French. Pas à pas, step by step. Nulle part, nowhere. Ne sait comment, knows how. Petit pas, tiny steps. Obstinément, stubbornly. And then just to keep the water imagery going, here's the last page. It's 2018 as I drew this, and Marcuse still calls to me stubbornly. People in the 60s became aware that they don't have to spend their lives in deadly, dehumanizing performances. They don't have to live in a polluted environment, that society is rich enough to do away with depression. Urban campus revolts outline the limits of containment, and beyond those limits, a realm of freedom. The rulers recognized the danger and answered with the streamlining of repression. And here we see the mall with everybody's head bent down to their devices. But with the streamlining of repression, the mind had to be taken in hand by electronic controls. But a new sensibility emerges in any struggle against violence and exploitation, affirming the right to build a universe where the sensuous, the beautiful, the playful become the form of society itself. Change the world, live a little.
Bravo.
Thank you.
So I've got a couple of questions.
Go for it.
These are not necessarily directly about the book. I have some questions about that too. But I think by the time we get there, we'll turn it over to the audience. Back in the all right, in the book, there is some discussion early on about the alienation of the artist from society and the splitting of the artist's mind from the realities around him or her. And someone there longs for the day when the artist was organic to society. For Marcuse, that seems to have been the Norse sagas and so on, right?
Yes, thanks.
Lionel trilling like medieval villages in the church. And you, in those days, working for UPA, were fairly firm that working within a collective was preferable to working on your own. And I can attest, actually, that cartoon he showed had a tremendous amount of editorial input. The cartoon that I first dreamed up was very, very different from that. It wasn't in the voice of a businessman and an advertiser, for example. It was more directly critical. So, what about this book? I see we have two editors listed on the cover, Paul Buell and somebody I know.
Andy Lamas.
And I'm wondering, what was your process? What was their role, and so on?
Paul Buell is an old friend from. I met him in Madison in the '60s, and this was his idea. So his role was certainly crucial, and he brought the project to City Lights. He was much more into Marcuse when we were young than I was, and over the years of our friendship, his enthusiasm for Marcuse made me feel guilty about not encountering Marcuse more thoroughly earlier. But once we committed to this, I began to read his books and learn about his life and meet all these people who knew him, including his son. Andy is the mover and shaker of the Marcuse Society, and he has been totally indispensable in keeping me in touch with the people in that group, and both Paul and Andy offered helpful criticisms. My only other two, really, I tried to get people in the Marcuse Society to give me a lot of input. I don't think most of them read comics. I think that I did not get much from them. I got a lot from my wife Cynthia, who's here, and my daughter Ruby, who's not. But Paul and Andy caught a lot of things that I'm glad are not in the book anymore, and convinced me to think things through a little more thoroughly. So, I don't think anything is ever an individual project, and this wasn't. But this, compared to the stuff we used to do in UPA, I wasn't trying too hard to do this collectively.
I would not call this a critical biography. It is a celebration of Marcuse. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Occasionally you put criticisms of Marcuse in the mouths of various people he dealt with, and I wonder, can you say some more about that? I mean, do you have any criticisms of Marcuse? And one that leaped to mind is this idea that cars are nothing but are an outlet for our aggressive impulses that are built up from the pressures of society. But there may be other things too. I don't know. How do you feel about all that?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I do knock him at one point in the book, the One-Dimensional Man. And I don't even know if I've mentioned his two masterpieces, Eros and Civilization, which he wrote in the 50s, which was inspired the beginning of his fame, and One Dimensional Man, which came out in the 60s. And I think what the book says is people have rightly criticized Marcuse for exaggerating the level of harmony between the classes in the post-war period. Marcuse makes a fairly outlandish statement about how workers and their bosses go to the same restaurants and drive the same cars, and we shouldn't pretend that means that they are the same. Well, the first part does not ring true to me. I think he sees. He's talking about a period in which the labor had made tremendous gains, and it was possible for people, industrial workers, to live a decent life in a way that had not been possible before the rise of the industrial unions. But this was, it does not seem to me like you can plausibly claim that they were driving the same cars and enjoying the same pleasures. The other place where I might have overdone it in terms of giving him the benefit of the doubt, I really don't know, is in his conflicts with his colleagues in the institute. His students felt fairly bitter towards Adorno and Horkheimer, and thought that he was treated very shabbily by them. I've had a long-standing prejudice against Adorno because he hated jazz.
That's right.
And George Mosse, one of my favorite teachers, who was also a German-Jewish emigre, once said, when you read Adorno and Horkheimer talking about popular culture, it makes the hair stand up on your head. It's so ridiculous. But the essential conflict was that Adorno and Horkheimer clung to the critique of modern society and lost all interest in how you might change that. And when the New Left came along, they were bitterly opposed to it. And so the book is, on Adorno particularly, is I'm consistently hard on that person. And Joe Sacco, who, like Larry and I, does nonfiction political comics, but he's a giant in that field. Read the manuscript and liked it, but said I think you're too hard on Adorno, and that might be true.
There's a place where the students it's Adorno, who the women are dancing around like the Three Graces, embarrassing him with the sexual revolution, and Marcuse writes something like, I may not be against patricide,
Yeah.
right? And I thought, well, that's because you're not the father they're trying to kill, you know?
Yes, he didn't go back to Germany. And Hans Gerth, who, did I mention Hans Gerth? He's the person that introduced me to Walter Benjamin, another German immigrant, but not Jewish. Was also treated very badly according to his son-in-law, my cousin, by the radical students in Germany. And all I have to say about that in the comic is that German education is much more patriarchal than American, and the students were correspondingly more angry at their daddy professors. But yes, Marcuse could say that Adorno should just take it, but the fact was, the criticisms of Adorno were just. He supported the U.S. in Vietnam. And he did not, from their point of view, do the resistance that he constantly talked about.
This is a slight digression, and then we'll have some. But Paul Buell at the moment is on a tear on Facebook in order to destroy the reputation of Hannah Arendt. And part of the charge against her is that she took money from the CIA. And yet you say he's the head of the Marcuse Society, or something like that, right? That he's involved in, he loves Marcuse. But Marcuse worked for the OSS.
Right. Yes. Well, Marcuse worked for the OSS when it was during the war, when it was fighting fascism, and that's That's the defense of Marcuse. He was the Progressive Labor, one of the first of the Leninist groups to come out of the New Left. Put out a pamphlet saying the title was Marcuse, Cop Out or Cop, and they brought up his work with the OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA, but he did not work with the CIA. He moved over to the State Department, and he did reports for them about, in which he said things that they didn't want to hear, so they ignored him. I don't quite know how he was able to keep that job for a few years when they didn't want to hear what he had to say, but that was that part. I don't know. This is the first I've heard that Hannah Arendt had anything to do with the CIA, but Paul does this.
That was one of these, CIA art support organizations that helped fund one of her projects, something like that.
Yeah,
There's
Paul
some
did-
other issues too.
Yeah.
She didn't like black studies programs, for example.
She didn't like desegregation. She was, and she made all kinds of excuses for their joint mentor. Hannah Arendt and Marcuse met in Freiburg. They were both disciples of Martin Heidegger, the brilliant phenomenologist who wound up as a Nazi during the war, and the Nazis put him in charge of Freiburg University. Both of them owed Heidegger a lot and wanted to make excuses for him, but Marcuse could not do so, and Hannah Arendt found a way to make excuses for Heidegger's behavior. Paul was supposed to be here tonight. He for personal reasons he couldn't be here, so I wish he was here to talk about Hannah Arendt because he knows more.
Let's take a question back there. The one against the wall. Yes.
I read Marcuse when I was in Berkeley in the 60s, and a number of us read it, and a number of us felt like this guy is really pretty depressing. And I remember people say, you think he's depressing, you should read Adorno. But I think what happened, I would like to ask you if you treat the essay on liberation in your book.
Yes.
Because that was the turning point, because I read that later, and it was like and it was directly because he encountered the New Left, I think.
Well, that's safe to say. Yeah. He was. In short order, he wrote an essay on liberation, which is treated in the comic, and as the New Left collapsed, he wrote repression. What is it? A book on
Progressive Tolerance.
No, not repressive tolerance. A book on repression and counter-revolution or something like that, which is where he goes back to the critique of all the things that control people and keep them from standing up for themselves. So, yes, an essay on liberation is a very exciting text inspired by the New Left, and in practice, the big difference between Marcuse and his former colleagues was that he embraced this flowering of resistance and creativity, and when Adorno and his friends in Germany were alarmed and horrified by it.
Do you see do you think Freud has anything to do with that? It's clear that Freud was an influence on Marcuse. I know nothing about any of the other. I know nothing about any of them actually, but did the others take Freud as seriously and show such an interest in the idea of Eros?
I don't know that Eros figures in the other writings. Like I said, I'm not very familiar with the other Frankfurt School writings, except for a bit more about Walter Benjamin. But Marcuse wrote Eros and Civilization as a philosophical critique of Freud's civilization and its discontents, and there's a whole segment here on Eros and Civilization. I'd like to mention that part of what sold me on this project was not Paul so much as Paul's wife, Mary Jo, who's a leading women's historian, and I learned from her that when she was an undergraduate, like so many of my contemporaries, wanting to study psychology, and everybody, I remember this distinctly, would take Psychology 101 and be told, well, we're not going to tell you why people do the things they do. We're going to put you in a laboratory with some rats and have you write down numbers based on what the rats do. And she turned to, and she somehow, Eros and Civilization crossed her desk, and she found a wealth of very original thought about the feminine principle and the performance principle, and a very original reading that's revisionist of Freudian thought, that emphasizes, I think he talks about Prometheus, the masculine controlling technology performance principle, bringing fire to humanity, and in opposition to Pandora, who is the female principle that is seen as disruptive and chaotic. And I had Prometheus on the top of the old Prudential building in Boston, waving his fires around, and Pandora is opening her box, and all the new wave feminists are saying, open it, open it, open it. So if your question is, did Freud have something to do with Marcuse's openness to the rebel movements? Yes, but sideways. It was the critique of Freud that clarified his insights.
We have a question back there.
Other than your liberal use of pull quotes from Marcuse's
Excuse
writing, other than your liberal use of pull quotes from Marcuse's writings and interviews, in what ways were you able to engage with him directly in preparation of your biography?
Well, I talked to people that knew him, and I went to I live near Waltham, where he taught, and Newton, where he lived in those years, and I visited San Diego and the beach towns there, but most important, I talked a lot to Peter Marcuse, his son, and because a big problem was that there's a lot written about his thought and not very little about his life and what kind of a man he was, and so his I mentioned George Katsifikas, who taught he taught in Boston, and is a disciple, and knew him socially. My mother's friend Anita Schiller knew him socially, and she told me some stuff, and Lowell Bergman, who I knew as an undergraduate, gave me some great stuff. I didn't show the whole business of when Marcuse was most famous, he was also most infamous, and some people shot up his garage. He was receiving death threats, and so his graduate students, including Lowell, used to accompany him between his house and the campus with concealed weapons, and that's in the book. So I did everything I could to learn who he was and what his relationships were, and I also have sections about background. I think since his connection to the New Left is a big reason that we're interested in him, I have a long digression about the counterculture and the New Left, which I was not based on research because I lived through it. So I had lots of things I wanted to say about that anyway. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
in a manner. Thank you.
Dickie?
So, yeah, I think you do a good job of bringing him alive as an individual. But here's this moment when he breaks the glass in time of need and takes out a typewriter and becomes a philosopher. What is it like to try to write a comic book about the philosopher part of him, and what did you most want people to get about that?
What I wanted people to get about that is that his life and the struggles that he participated in were the basis of the philosophy. And that's what interests me about him and continues to interest me about him. So that was the reason for the background material about counterculture and the background information about the street battles in Berlin during the Weimar Republic and a whole bunch of things like that. So I think that's what makes it a comic-worthy story. There's a lot of action behind his thought and informing his thought, and I try showing that made it easier to do this, and also learning what kind of a person he was and his sense of humor and his relationships also made it more comics worthy. And Larry knows all about this. Comics is a good way of talking about people's thoughts. People's thoughts can seem dreadfully abstract when you see them written on a page of a book, but if you can bring them to life with metaphor, they become more alive and more real to people. And so figuring out how to do that is a big part of what was fun about this. And I mentioned to an audience, I think maybe at the DSA event, that you and I used to work for dollars and cents, and you were hired on the principle that somebody that knew nothing about economics would be perfect to write popular economics things. And I came in as a cartoonist on pretty much the same level of not having any economics training, and like looking at ways to make these ideas tangible.
So I'm making an assumption, which maybe I shouldn't make, but you probably assume that everyday comics.
Pardon me?
Everyday comics. You read the comic page daily, but you have for 50 years?
No.
No.
And I would if they weren't so disrespected by modern newspapers. Like, I can't bear to see the tiny little comics that we see today.
Well, this, may I,
Yeah.
I mean, this brings up something I don't know anything about you before I met you. So, we do see, although you don't read comics now, Crazy Cat makes an appearance, and so does Mr. Dithers from Dagwood, and some others in this book. So I wonder if you could say something about about your growing up and how you came to comics and how you came to politics. You do mention your father in the book as a professor. Can you say some more about that?
Yeah, when we old guys were young people, comics were there was people did not have TVs in their homes, and children read comics to an extent that you just cannot imagine. The popular comics sold in the millions, and if you count the people that read them, because kids would pass them hand to hand, it was in multiples of millions, and
they cost a dime.
And
For a nickel.
yeah. And so my brother and I would just say, let's try that, and we would mash up the Lone Ranger and Bugs Bunny and do the Lone Bunny and do these stories like that. And that's how I learned to tell a story with pictures. It doesn't come naturally. You have to look at it. But I was enchanted by comics, and in the middle of that comics era, that pre-TV era, Mad Comics came along, and Mad was this fantastic publication that where the artists were able to mimic the styles of our favorite comics, but turn the stories on their heads, so that Jughead and Archie are juvenile delinquents, and Mickey Rodin is a gangster, and so on. And so critical theory. I was introduced to that at an early age. So yeah, and starting in junior high school, I ran a humor magazine, and all through high school.
Where was this?
This was Storrs, Connecticut. Storrs, Connecticut. My father was a professor at the University of Connecticut.
Of what?
University of Quebec.
What was his discipline?
Economics. Yeah.
No wonder you don't know.
Yeah, yes.
Speaking of economics, I need to insert this, because Marcuse is famous for a critique of consumerism, and we hear the word consumer all the time. And this is something I literally never noticed until I did this hypercapitalism book with this psychology professor, and that is that consume does not mean to buy or to use. It means to use up and destroy. It's, and we take this word for granted, It's not just about buying things. It's about eating up what's in the earth and annihilating it so that, we're forced to buy more. It's very disturbing. So remember that the next time you hear somebody on the radio saying, consumer sentiment, right, what they're really saying.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I wonder about the subtitle. I was always struck by the famous slogan from 1968, "Be realistic, demand the impossible," which I believe comes from Marcuse.
I think it's actually the situation is, but that it was a French slogan, but it certainly encapsulates his thinking. But he wrote an essay, "The End of Utopia," and what he meant by that was that a decent life is within our grasp in a way that it wasn't before industrial technology. And when he talks about consumption, he's talking about using the tools that we have to make a better life rather than to make profits and force people to work harder and be more miserable at work. So utopia has a double meaning. It's when he says the end of utopia, he's using it in the common sense of what people dream for but they can't have. He's saying that's over, we can have it, but it's also used in the other sense of giving yourself the mental freedom to imagine what you really want in society, and regardless of the obstacles that you see around you at any given moment. So, philosopher of utopia. We were going to say the philosopher of utopia, and Elaine said drop the villa, and that was good advice. Anybody else?
Any more questions? Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit about Eric Fromm or Marcuse relationship? There is a page.
Yes. Eric Fromm was a part of the institute in Germany, and he came in late in their first German phase, and he was put in charge of. He and Paul Lazarsfeld were put in charge of an empirical study of the attitudes of German workers, and they got a lot of questionnaires back, and they were surprised to discover that a lot of working people that identified with the left had what they considered to be authoritarian personalities, and this leads to the critique of the pessimism about the potential for achieving positive change through the class struggle, which we tend to think of as characteristic of them. The conflict, which I give a page to, which I thought was fascinating, was that Eric Fromm was friends with Marcuse at the point that Eros and Civilization came out, but he wrote a critique of it, saying some fairly, what seemed to be wild criticisms, like you're privileging sexual desire, and you're totalizing the class struggle, whereas you should be paying attention to the cooperative movement in France, which Fromm thought was a very positive development, and Marcuse wrote a pretty tough response on those 2 points. He said, I'm not substituting sex for love. I'm saying love is desire plus tenderness and compassion. What's wrong with that? And and as far as the co-ops in France go, as far as I'm concerned, they accept the biblical injunction that you have to suffer for your supper, and I don't believe that. And this debate destroyed their friendship. I understand that Fromm ran into Marcuse on a train a year or two later and wouldn't talk to him, and passed on by, which is sad. Yeah, but somebody spoke at one of the Marcuse events who was a Fromm scholar, and he felt strong. He felt that the left has not treated Erich Fromm, given him his due, and that might be correct. But he did not see eye to eye eventually and he broke with the Institute over his liberalism long before he had the quarrel with Marcuse. So he was his book sold better than anybody in the Institute, but he was not of them or with them by then.
I know we're getting weary.
Oh, we got time.
Well, you're all lucky. It slipped my mind. Okay.
Are we done?
I guess we're done.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Senior Lights, so much for doing this.
Thank you. So we have books to sign. You may have them signed up here and then pay for them on the way out. And thank you again for joining us. And